Have you ever wondered what's really happening with your money? In December 2024, the Federal Reserve quietly released its latest money supply numbers. Buried in that data is a reality that most people haven't even begun to process. M2, the main measure of money in our economy, now sits around $21.2 trillion. Now, that might just sound like a big number, but let's put it in context. In January 2020, before the world changed, that number was $15.4 trillion. In less than 5 years, the United States created nearly $5.8 trillion out of thin air. That's a 38% expansion of the money supply. Think about it this way. The entire U.S. money supply back in 1980 was only $1.6 trillion. In just the last 5 years, we've printed more than 3.5 times the entire monetary base of the 1980 economy. But here's the part that almost no one is talking about. The real inflation hasn't even fully hit yet. What you felt in 2021 and 2022, with prices soaring for food, rent, and energy, that wasn't the main event. That was just the preview. See, massive money printing doesn't hit the economy all at once. It moves in waves. The first wave hits asset prices. We saw stocks surge 60% from 2020 levels, and housing prices jump nearly 50%. That was wave one. The second wave hit our everyday lives. Groceries, gas, insurance, rent. That's where households felt the squeeze. But the third wave, the one that historically devastates the middle class, is still forming. And the danger isn't just about the money that's already been printed. It's about what has to be printed next. To service the massive $36 trillion national debt, the system requires exponentially more currency. This is the debt inflation spiral. On C starts. It doesn't just stop. It accelerates until the currency itself is fundamentally damaged. There's no realistic way to pay off this debt. The only politically survivable option is inflation. It's a quiet transfer of wealth, shifting trillions from savers and wage earners to asset holders in the state. This isn't just a theory. It's a historical pattern. When governments print money to cover debts they can't repay, the outcome is always the same. Across 2,000 years of history, monetary systems fail in a remarkably consistent way through 4 stages, and no major civilization has ever skipped one. Stage 1 is the foundation. A trusted currency backed by something real, like gold or silver. This creates confidence, which fuels savings and growth. This stage can last for centuries, so people forget it can end. Stage 2 begins when a government's costs, from wars to welfare, outpace its revenue. So, it starts to dilute the currency. In ancient times, they'd reduce the silver content in coins. Today, they just print more paper. Leaders insist it's temporary, and because life looks normal, most people believe them. Stage 3 is where control is lost. The currency debasement speeds up, inflation rises, and confidence cracks. This is the critical moment. The middle class, whose wealth is in savings and paychecks, sees their purchasing power collapse. Meanwhile, those closest to the money, crescendo, insiders, and large asset holders, see what's happening? They convert their cash into real assets, buying up property and businesses from desperate sellers. Wealth concentrates at the top, rapidly. Stage 4 is the reset. The old currency becomes worthless, and a new one is introduced. But by then, the damage is done. Wealth has been transferred from millions of households to a small elite, and most people never even realized when it happened. This isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint. Look at Rome. In the 1st century, their silver coin, the denarius, was 95% pure. That stability built a strong middle class. But after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Emperor Nero needed money. He cut the silver content to 80%. The coin looked the same, but it was worth less. Over the next century, this continued. By the mid-3rd century, Rome's currency had almost no silver left. Prices exploded. A lifetime of savings became worthless. Small landowners and merchants were wiped out, but those who owned land, livestock, and buildings survived. The assets didn't change. The currency did. By the time Rome tried to reform its money, wealth was already in the hands of a few hundred families. The middle class was gone, and soon after, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Once you see this four-stage pattern, you start recognizing it everywhere. The question we have to ask ourselves is, which stage are we in now? History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Let's look at a pattern that destroyed empires and wiped out the middle class. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. And the scary part, we might be living through the final stage of it right now. It started in ancient Rome. Faced with massive debts, the emperors started mixing cheaper metals into their silver coins. A little at first, then a lot. People who saved those coins, thinking they were holding wealth, ended up with worthless tokens. Their life savings, gone. Fast forward to Germany in the 1920s. After World War I, Germany was crushed by reparations. It couldn't pay. So, they did what governments always do when their backs are against the wall. They printed money. At first, it wasn't so bad. But soon, the dam broke. In 1919, 9 marks bought $1. By November 1923, it took trillions. A wheelbarrow full of cash couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. Families who had saved their whole lives, who did everything right, lost it all. Their savings, their pensions, but people who owned real things, like farms or factories, survived. And those who were in debt, they got to pay back their loans with worthless paper money. It was a massive, brutal transfer of wealth. This economic trauma didn't just disappear. It fueled anger, resentment, and the rise of extremism. Now, let's talk about the United States. After World War II, the dollar was backed by gold. This created stability and trust around the world. But by the late 1960s, spending on wars and social programs was draining the nation's gold reserves. The math just didn't work anymore. So, in 1971, President Nixon made a stunning announcement. The U.S. was cutting the dollar's tie to gold. Overnight, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith. What happened next wasn't a sudden crash like in Germany. It was a slow, creeping erosion. The 1970s brought soaring inflation and high unemployment. Your paycheck just didn't go as far. But if you owned asset stocks, real estate, gold, you did great. Their prices skyrocketed. This was the beginning of a quiet but profound shift. Wealth inequality, which had been relatively stable, started to widen dramatically. Before 1971, the middle class could build wealth through saving. After 1971, the game changed. To get ahead, you had to own assets. Savers were punished, and debtors and asset holders were rewarded. This wasn't a bug. It was a feature of the new system. So, where are we today? The U.S. national debt has exploded from under $400 billion in the 70s to over $36 trillion today. The interest we pay on that debt is now one of the biggest items in the federal budget. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. More debt means more interest payments. More interest payments mean bigger deficits. Bigger deficits mean we have to borrow even more money. And when there aren't enough buyers for that debt, who steps in? The central bank, which creates new money out of thin air to buy it. That is inflation, by design. Many people think inflation is over because prices stabilized for a bit, but that's a critical mistake. Inflation comes in waves. The first wave pumps up the price of assets. The second wave hits you at the grocery store. But the third wave is the most destructive. It's when your income can't keep up with rising costs, no matter how hard you work. This is the wave that quietly wipes out the middle class. At this point, there are no easy answers. Big spending cuts are politically impossible. Massive tax hikes would be political suicide. That leaves one option: print the money. It's the default choice because it delays the pain and hides who's responsible. You feel poorer, but it's hard to point a finger at any single person or policy. It's a slow-motion transfer of wealth, just like in Rome and Germany. The pattern has never failed, because the incentives for those in power never change. The real question is no longer if this process will continue, but how fast it will accelerate from here. To understand how fast this is accelerating, you have to look at the real numbers, not the promises. Right now, the M2 money supply is sitting just over $21 trillion. Back in early 2020, it was only about $15 trillion. That's a nearly $6 trillion expansion before the full impact of the debt even hit. Today, the national debt is over $36 trillion. We're running annual deficits close to 2 trillion, and they're getting bigger. The interest payments alone have crossed $1 trillion a year, making them one of the biggest federal expenses. And this is where the system starts to feed on itself. Interest isn't just a side cost anymore. It's becoming the main driver of government spending. As interest rates stay high, those interest payments automatically grow. These payments make the deficit larger, which adds to the debt, which then increases the interest payments again. It's a loop that runs on autopilot. No bad decisions required. Official projections say interest payments will hit 2 trillion a year within the next decade. And that's the optimistic view. If rates stay where they are, it'll happen even sooner. At the same time, spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is also expanding. Within 10 years, these mandatory programs plus interests are projected to eat up all federal tax revenue. That means every other part of government, infrastructure, education, public services will have to be funded entirely by borrowing. There's no mathematical way out of this without either major restructuring or inflation. The government technically has 3 options. First, cut spending. But that would mean cutting benefits for tens of millions of people, which is political suicide. So that option is off the table. Second, raise taxes dramatically. To balance the budget this way, tax hikes would have to be so massive they'd crush the economy and cause political collapse. That's not happening either. So what's left? The third option. Monetary expansion. Just create new money, use it to buy government debt, and let the currency take the hit. This option is always on the table. The Federal Reserve is already doing this. Its balance sheet exploded to nearly $9 trillion during the crisis, and is still way above pre-2020 levels. While officials talk about tightening, the reality is the central bank holds trillions in government debt. As foreign countries buy less of our debt, the Fed has to step in as the buyer of last resort. That means creating new money, whether they call it that or not. This is how you get structural inflation. It's not a conspiracy. It has the natural outcome when debt gets so big, it can be paid off through growth or taxes. Every major currency collapse has followed this exact script. What happens next unfolds over years, not months. First, you'll see nominal numbers rise. Asset prices will climb. GDP will look like it's growing. On paper, the economy looks bigger, but your real purchasing power tells a different story. If inflation is running at 8%, while your wages only grow at 4%, you're losing ground every single year. After a decade, that loss isn't small. It's devastating. Housing is a perfect example. A house bought for $400,000 in 2020 might be valued at $700,000. A decade later, it looks like you've made a ton of money. But if overall prices have tripled, that house is actually worth less in real terms. Even worse, you're trapped, because every other house has inflated even faster. The same thing happens to your retirement savings. A portfolio growing at 7% a year feels good, but if inflation is averaging 10%, your purchasing power is shrinking. The numbers go up, but your real wealth vanishes. Most people won't unrealize this until they try to retire and find their life savings buys a lot less than they planned for, and wages get hit the hardest. Pay raises almost always lag behind inflation. By the time you get a raise, prices have already gone up again. Obera de Cadi, your real income can fall by 40%, even if your nominal paycheck is much bigger. This is why you feel poorer, even when you're making more money. This is the middle class trap. The system is set up to reward owning assets and punish holding cash. If you own stocks, real estate, or a business, your wealth grows with inflation. If you depend on a salary and have savings in the bank, you absorb the cost. Inflation acts as a hidden wealth transfer, pushing wealth upward. For the wealthy, it's a different story. They hold assets that grow with inflation. A fixed-rate mortgage gets easier to pay off as inflation erodes its real value. For them, inflation isn't a threat, it's a tool. This is why wealth inequality skyrockets during these periods. It's not about who works harder. It's about the monetary structure. Astis, goes. On social, pressure builds. People know something is wrong, but it's hard to pinpoint. Trust in institutions fades. Political division gets worse. Eventually, governments try to manage the symptoms with things like price controls, which never work. They make it harder to move your money out of the system, a process called financial repression. The system doesn't collapse overnight, it just reshapes itself. The tragedy is that this whole process is invisible while it's still reversible. By the time it becomes obvious, the wealth transfer is already done. The numbers on your statements look bigger, but the purchasing power is gone. The middle class loses a little bit every year, until the total loss is just too big to ignore. That's the cycle we're in now. The setup is complete. The acceleration has begun. Once a country's debt starts accelerating, the outcome isn't up for debate. It's just simple math. Right now, the total debt in the United States, that's the government, households, and corporations, all put together is around $90 trillion, but our annual economic output is only about 28 trillion. This means our D2 GDP ratio is over 300%. History tells us that when a nation crosses the 250% threshold, there are really only two ways out: default or inflation. A default would cause an immediate, catastrophic collapse. Inflation, on the other hand, stretches that collapse out over time. So, which one do you think governments always choose? They pick inflation, because it seems manageable and helps them stay in power. Trying to grow our way out of this is impossible. The debt keeps piling up by trillions every year, while real economic growth is just not keeping pace, and paying it down with budget surpluses that would require multi-trillion-dollar surpluses year after year, something no modern democracy has ever managed to do. This leaves inflation as the only real tool left in the box. By letting prices rise, the government inflates the nominal size of the economy, which makes the real value of its debt shrink. This isn't an accident or a policy mistake. It's the chosen solution when all other options are off the table. Let's imagine inflation averages 10% a year for a decade, while the economy grows at 2%. On paper, the nominal GDP nearly triples. The debt also grows, but its real value shrinks. The ratio improves, and it looks like the crisis is solved. But in reality, your purchasing power has been systematically destroyed. The impact of this is brutal, and it hits different people in different ways. The average household has most of its wealth in a home, retirement accounts, and of course income from a job. While your house price might go up, its real value could be stagnant or even falling. Your retirement account might look bigger on your statement, but it buys you less. Your wages will creep up, but the cost of everything else skyrockets. After 10 years, the family that seems richer on paper may have actually lost a third or even more of their real wealth. Savers get hit the hardest. If you have cash or bonds, you're guaranteed to lose. $100,000 in a safe account could lose more than half its purchasing power over a decade. Young people starting their careers are at a huge disadvantage. A good starting salary today quickly becomes not enough, and saving for a house becomes a moving target as prices inflate faster than their income. But for some, the story is completely different. Large asset holders often preserve and even increase their real wealth. Stock prices rise with nominal economic growth. Big businesses just pass their rising costs on to you, the consumer. Landlords raise rents while their mortgage debt shrinks in real terms. Suddenly, debt becomes a powerful tool, not a risk. For those who are positioned correctly, inflation actually concentrates wealth. Corporations with pricing power, resource owners, and real estate investors do very well. Even the government itself. But inflation reduces the real value of its own massive debt. That $36 trillion of national debt becomes a lot less scary when measured in currency that's worth less and less. This is the ultimate wealth transfer. It moves wealth from everyday workers, savers, and retirees to asset holders, large debtors, and the state itself. And it all happens quietly, without a single vote or big announcement. It's so gradual that most people only notice the devastating result, not the cause. Eventually, we reach the final stage. The currency system as we know it can no longer function. At that point, a few things could happen. The currency could lose its global reserve status. Inflation could spiral out of control, forcing a complete currency reset, or the government could impose strict financial controls. In reality, it's usually a mix of all three. By the time the reset is complete, the damage is done. The middle class emerges with its savings and stability shattered. Those who held large assets come out even stronger. The system restarts with new rules, but the wealth gap is wider than ever. This is why a currency collapse is more than just an economic event. It's a social transformation. It changes everything: our incentives, our behavior, and our political landscape. Trust is eroded because the promises made were kept in name only, but broken in real value. We are standing at that critical inflection point right now. The debt is unpayable. History shows us this pattern time and time again, from ancient Rome to modern times. Unpayable debt is never paid back honestly. It's dissolved through currency debasement. The burden doesn't just disappear, it's transferred. And it's always the people holding the currency who end up paying the price. Thanks for watching. If you found this information valuable, please like, share, and subscribe for more content.